CTO here with WatchGuard, and we're going to go through a couple things in today's webinar. The first is a quick history lesson. I think it's important to understand why firewalls have become security platforms and what you should expect from your NetSec vendor. Then we're going to tell you why we see SonicWall partners switching over to WatchGuard. There's been a really high number of companies bringing their NetSec portfolio to WatchGuard because of the value we provide, both technical and business. We're going to walk through some of those reasons for you today as well. We're going to look at, what are some of the things that we can do that others can't, right? It's really valuable to have a nice, powerful differentiator in the market. So we'll share ours as well and help you hopefully as an MSP or partner have a go-forward strategy that's really all about how to maximize your business, how to grow, your revenue, your profit, what you can do to kind of future-proof your contracts. And so we're going to walk through some of those designs as well as we go through the webinar. All right, let's start with the big question here. Why have firewalls become security platforms? We're going to go through a technical reason as to why this is the case in 2026, what that really means. And so we're going to go through a couple of eras here to educate everybody who maybe wasn't there at this time as to what was going on back in the 1900s when the firewall first came on the scene. So if you were around back in the 1900s and you were looking at, firewalls from, your Checkpoint, your NetScreens, your WatchGuards, your Sidewinders, these old school names that, only true veterans would remember. You remember basically putting in potentially an appliance that was at the edge of a new network perimeter. You could call yourself an internet company by dropping in a firewall and you would filter ports. 25, 80, 443, these were the email and web traffic that was, allowed through the corporate perimeter. Maybe you had hosted, a BlackBerry server or something, and you had to open up a different port internally. And so the firewall's job at that point was to stop a very specific kind of attack, right? Which is that as we connected these internet connections through routers, most of the attacks were sort of these simple flood attacks. They would just sort of, hit stateful sessions and break the state, session hijack. So the word stateful inspection was sort of one of the early patents that people would sort of float around as to what a firewall did that a router didn't. And that is basically try to police traffic that was coming through the firewall and basically block a lot of the noise that was at the edge there that might shut things down. Now, of course, at this point in time, you didn't really see cybersecurity much more than just sort of an outage situation, right? Worms, flooding, that was really all people were about. And of course, if you remember 2002, the #1 song at the time was Nickelback's How You Remind Me, right? And the top video game was GTA Vice City. So, they take the good with the bad here. But one of the things about, Nickelback, somewhat ironically, is that I like to call this the Iron Age of the firewall, where we had, an appliance, some steel over there at the edge of the network. You could walk the data center, see the cool little blinking lights. You maybe saw a red box. Maybe you saw, a Nokia sign, and some people thought that was maybe for cell phones, right? Where you were running your Checkpoint software. So a lot of this, era was really defined by the fact that we were just building out the internet. There was really only 2 apps. The firewall's job was remote access and to filter ports. And that was pretty much it for this era, right? As you kind of roll on, people started making more out of their data center and started hosting more applications internally, right? Whether it was a raised floor, whether it was, an actual dedicated co-location data center, right? In the 2000s and 2010s, everything pretty much funnels through 80 and 443. At this point, you're starting to see the app era take off, right? The iPhone's created. You've got this concept that there are these websites that maybe we don't want people to come to, or devices that we don't want people to use on our internal networks, most of it for productivity reasons. We don't really have control. We're sort of fighting the BYOD craze. But for the most part, the firewall doesn't really change, right? In the previous era, they competed based on the number of megabits per second. Like my firewall can handle 100 meg and yours can't, right? And so the idea is that there wasn't really much beyond the idea that you were going to filter ports and IPs. And in this era, once we start virtualizing, we start to see apps coming up, a lot of the value in bringing in things such as URL filters, maybe a little bit of app awareness. This is just sort of in its infancy is what we want to try to do. Mostly to block, unproductives from using Facebook all day on the corporate network. network instead of doing their jobs, right? Also at this point in time, the attackers, really easily coming into these internal networks and shutting them down with, lateral movement. But there's not a lot of incentive to do it because crypto isn't really a thing that much in this era. So while attackers are totally able to come into the internal network where, we built virtual firewalls and EDRs, forward-looking companies like WatchGuard made those technologies, in those times, right? The Panda acquisition and Firebox V. Most people didn't deploy it in their internal networks, right? They still had these sort of soft, simple, flat networks that, as soon as an attacker showed up, would wreak havoc on them. It's just that the attackers really weren't motivated to do this. Now, music gets slightly better depending on who you're talking to, right? We've got Kesh's TikTok is #1 on the Billboard 100, and Call of Duty at this point in time is the game of the year. So, mostly good things happening in this era, depending on who you ask. Then we move over to a more familiar era for somebody that's basically been deploying technology within the last 2 decades. From 2010 to the 2020s, we have a bit of a shift, right? And this is where the firewall still kind of lives at the edge for most people. It's still just connected to the internet. Mobile, phones and ISPs are now stretching applications over the cloud, data center. Access is kind of happening everywhere. And so for the smart technology companies, this is the beginning of the platform, is to say, okay, well, we can't stay in the same place. We can't just block the same thing. We don't have the same capabilities if we're just looking at packets at the edge of one part of the network. And so as firewalls start to morph to look at this new zero-day trend, everything from the endpoint and the cloud and internal network security is all being reimagined into what's called a zero trust design, where every single packet needs to be inspected, and people are sort of arguing in the community about how to do that. Some want to sell you a giant iron firewall to go between your core switch and all your users. Some want to send you, virtual firewall microservices that live inside the virtual machine. Some people are doing a version of the cloud, Amazon, Microsoft version of security. And so there's really this kind of great debate as to where this territory is going to be sort of captured in the design of the firewall. And at this point, many vendors have already invested in an endpoint component, in some sort of cloud delivered technology, and WatchGuard, of course, is at one of the forefront there. But you also have, vendors sort of falling behind. If you look at most of the companies that failed to adapt to this era, if you look at the first era, there was probably about 50 firewall vendors, and you're shrinking by almost half at this point. There's probably less than 20 vendors in the 2010s that are still making and selling a firewall, and because they just failed to adapt to the needs of the market, right? With a few stragglers still behind, and we'll get to those a little later. Now, for those of you who haven't been keeping up with the crypto trends, obviously these ransomware actors were making billions and billions of dollars. So now this is happening almost every single day, multiple times a day. Are we breaching institutions, grabbing data, encrypting systems, and leaving behind helpful notes that they probably should have modernized their tech stack to get an EDR or some sort of logging and awareness of what's going on their network to prevent this from happening. And of course, doing things like auto patching vulnerabilities, which almost nobody does, but definitely should in this era. Now, at the time, Roddy Ricch, because of TikTok, the app is famous for the song "The Box." He's at #1 in 2020, the longest running #1 in 2020. And if you have kids that play Nintendo, this is probably where you stopped playing the video games. Is Animal Crossing: New Horizons is the game of the year, and I couldn't even draw 3 characters from that game. So. So this era really kind of defines people sort of in a hybrid IT environment. We don't leave the other eras behind. We don't move the firewall technology. We have to start building out new. And for a lot of people, the era we're in now is the era where they decide. Because it simply gets ahead too quickly for people in terms of how many breaches they're seeing in the old design. So as attackers are now AI powered, they're searching for vulnerabilities, literally any port, any app, any type of protocol, SSL, identity type protocol that you connect to your cloud with, they're all under siege. And the AI tools that we spent the last 6 years building, they're all now co-opted by attackers to basically automate this. And so we're at a point now where the traditional firewall is not just seen as a slow-moving protection system. It's actually the cause of some of the attacks using SSL VPN, because now they can reach the port, they can exploit SSL, they can get into the firewall, and they can pivot up or down or across the network any which way they choose and cause ransomware outages. This is something that a lot of SonicWall partners cite as a reason that they were, unhappy with the company, is that basically they had no way to patch this, they had no way to get around this, they were slow to communicate this, and as a result, people were starting to have their customers ransomwared and lose a lot of faith time and time again. Now, of course, in this era, breaches happen in minutes, probably less. The earliest, I think you can get breakout time recorded by breach reports is somewhere in the seconds range, so under a minute. So it's near real time. And luckily, the top song in this year, or last year, I should say, Sabrina Carpenter. I think it was a tie because it was which song was the song of the summer here. Sabrina Carpenter's Man Child or Espresso. I think it's a tie. And the most popular video game is Fortnite by number of users, which I find weird, but probably because of the dances, it's caught on and sort of never let go. All right, so that's kind of the history lesson as to why we needed to move things. And that's because the attacker and the application keep moving. It moves from our data center, it moves off our devices into the cloud, it moves off of our servers and into somebody else's servers, but it doesn't also always do that. So we have kind of this hybrid IT where it's sometimes the office has a printer and a file server, and we have Office 365 and a hybrid domain controller and a remote user that comes to the office and connects to their desktop. And unfortunately, if you just have a firewall that stays in one place, or a technology that sort of sits still as these attacks sort of evolve, you're probably sitting in a position unable to deal with all the attacks that are going to happen at scale. And so when we look at why firewalls have become a security platform, technically it's because they had to, right? The application didn't just stay parked, inside the data center. It didn't just stay two protocols on the internet that you could filter for IP and port. It didn't just stay, as iron. It had to morph into endpoint network technology such as NDR that we all needed to do this. Now, there's also a financial reason why the firewalls have become a platform, and we're going to get to that in just a sec. But before we do, we're going to do a quick quiz question. What was the total global cybersecurity spend in 2025? Was it 212? Sorry, was it 212 billion, 16.5 billion, 27.5 billion, or 2.75 billion? Now, fun fact, two of these numbers were last year's endpoint detection and response global spend, and one of these was last year's NetSec spend. So vote now. We're going to close the poll in just a few seconds. There is no prize money, I'm sorry, but the prize is maybe you'll be a millionaire by selling WatchGuard. Okay, we can close the poll. I think we have a pretty definitive winner here at 75%. Saying 212 billion. So a lot of you would have got that answer correct. Now, this does speak to the financial reasons as to why NetSec is the largest cyber tech spend. So if you look at all of cybersecurity spend over the last, let's call it 25 years, right? We've been around for 30, right? If we say, okay, there's been this sort of trend and it's been growing, I would say, more than doubling in some cases each year, right? The idea is that you have this sort of global spend of 212 billion, and then underneath it is what I think people would vote for as the most important technology, right? So the first thing is that in the early 2000s, we sold firewalls, and it maintained itself as the highest amount of market share for overall cybersecurity spend at almost 45%. And then as it started, trickling off, it didn't mean that, there was another technology that took its place. NetSec still is the largest cyber tech spend every year since its inception. It's just that something else has taken its place as spending more. There are 3 or 4 other categories that you typically take up the rest of the cyber tech spend bucket. The next big one is endpoint security. So if you think about your firewall vendor and they want to be able to take more market share, it's surprising that some have not invested in endpoint security. But the bundling is really in the concept of like connecting these together in a platform isn't something that's new. Almost any firewall that survived out of the 50 that started to the less than 10 that matter today had already started incorporating features like URL filtering or IPS into the programs, into their hardware and into their software firewalls because they had to, right? Those were technically still, if you remember WebSense and WebRoot, and if you remember, SourceFire or any of these other, pure play OneSecure and other dedicated IPS systems, right? The idea is that those used to stand alone, and then eventually through consolidation, they started putting them into the firewall. Then they called it, next generation firewall, UTM, whatever. But the idea was they had this necessity to fuse technologies together inside that edge that was, just sort of investigating the packets. And then they needed to go off the box, right? They needed to go to the next biggest territories, which were endpoint and identity, right? Because those are A, the next biggest spend, and B, the most, obviously, as a result, the most important places that you need to be to run your platform. So not doing this is a big problem. Now, of course, that kind of gives you a clue as to what WatchGuard's been up to for the last 30 years, is that for both technical and for business reasons, in order to, provide our partners with the most powerful platform they could use in the market to not only stop threats, but make themselves more profitable, we had to invest well beyond making the first firewall at the edge and grow to the platform that we are today. And so as you watch the history of this company go from, synthesizing, the UTM field by taking application control, by taking URL filtering, APT blocking, by expanding down into the internal network with Wi-Fi, by making sure we had XDR that could do threat detection and response to respond early as these attackers were modifying their game, flipping over to SafeNet acquisition and AuthPoint, having ourselves a little bit more on the endpoint in the Panda acquisition, developing things like the advanced endpoint security that we have today in the EDR, which, spoiler alert, won some pretty good accolades here with MITRE and the latest round of testing. And then, of course, where I came from, right? Once you layer all these technologies, all these control points, you have to operate this thing at scale. And so managed detection and response, especially with all the newest, greatest tools in AI, gave us an ability to find and stop threats in seconds across multiple severity levels and across all these products, right? And so as you look at, the ecosystem today, having a platform that can actually autonomously, both offensively and defensively, find and stop threats across the endpoint, network, and cloud gives you a clue that you're not only going to be more successful at stopping the adversary across all the eras in hybrid IT, but also the idea that you're going to be much more financially successful. So now we're going to have another Who Wants to Be a Millionaire question. This one is about that remaining part of the gray bar. So if you think about it, if technology spend in firewalls is only about, let's call it a small percentage, right? 27 billion, which is a gigantic number for those firewall NetSec sales, and EDR and identity and other things could be more. What is taking up that larger spend, right? What do companies spend more than 50% of their money on when it comes to cybersecurity overall? Is it A, security services, B, artificial intelligence, C, wireless networking, or D, cyber insurance? And I think a lot of people are pretty convinced as to what the answer is here. So I'm letting it, we can close the poll. I don't think there's not going to be a lot of dissension here. 100% security services, which is absolutely correct, right? And so if you look at the opportunity and how we're actually structuring some of the spend in the category, companies spend over 90 billion in 2025 on cybersecurity services, managed services, integration services, incident response, consulting, all these other aspects that it takes to run and operate the technology, right? Money that many of our partners, of which we're 100% channel, rely on this business to grow very, very profitably, right? Well, that only helps, obviously, if the community continues to buy, and good news, they do, through the channel, right? So nearly all cybersecurity products are bought through the channel, about 97% of them. And if you want to know where the other 3% are, you can ask Microsoft how that's going, right? So the direct model, the cutout, the channel aspect of this has not been very successful for many companies. And that's because of this pie chart, right? You cannot just sell technology services sell technology to end users and have it be operated. Number one, they need a lot of help in interpreting and managing and configuring and supporting what is a very complex product. Even if it is from a single platform and quite easy to use, it's certainly nothing that, you know, a small law office is going to be able to, you know, take on themselves. Now, the maximization here of growth, your ability to cross the categories, your ability to dominate in managed security services is going to depend on you taking the parts that they are spending money on. And so what's interesting here is that if you go through security services, you come over to network security technology, the next biggest spend, which is purely tech. Same with identity, same with endpoint security, and of course, cloud security. The concept here is that, you know, when you try to maximize your investment in a partner, looking at one that has more of a story around these different technology parts that you can operate for better security services revenue, that's going to be paramount to what you're doing, right? And so as you look at WatchGuard, hopefully this kind of paints the picture as to why this platform had moved beyond the firewall, even though that was sort of where our roots were back in the 30 years ago, right? And the idea is that the firewall and the network tools that you see up here on the network portion of the slide, this is where SonicWall has invested, and that's where they basically stayed. And as a result, not only do they have a lot of tech debt that you're starting to witness in the form of security vulnerabilities being exploited, but also in the fact that they're not market competitive to other companies that have platforms now. Your customers will demand that you operate at scale more profitably in the endpoint, in the identity, in the network security space, that you manage all the alerts and the different types of, you know, incidents that are produced by these products early and often, and that you have the capability to scale if the attacker decides to change their techniques or tactics, move up to, you know, a new automated tool called AI, or whether or not they just simply focus on a particular one of your customers late at night or on the weekend. And so you really have to think about the platform more as kind of consistent protection across these surfaces that continually get breached, both in the internal network, outside the network, into the cloud, and across anywhere your applications and users basically are, right? And the adversary is too. And so our job basically at WatchGuard was to develop a platform that would enable those businesses, but then also help scale that through the best-in-class type of technology. So when we deploy an agent, it's a unified agent, right? We don't just simply turn to the market and say, hey, you can go buy SentinelOne or CrowdStrike or Microsoft and hope that that standalone endpoint is going to do the job. No, we know that it must already have the capabilities for endpoint security mixed with proactive network security, identity, other aspects of being able to, you know, not only control the operating system, but to manage threats on the endpoint and connect that to something that is cloud delivered in the WatchGuard cloud, AI powered in the case of MDR and other tools in the market, and then have a very strong network position for things that can't run an agent, right? NDR, Firebox, FireCloud, Firebox V, they're all about getting our products in between the adversary and the application, whether the application is in the cloud, whether it's on our internal network, or whether it's inside of a hypervisor somewhere on a virtual machine, right? We're also extending our capabilities out to third parties, so we'll connect to Amazon and Microsoft and others. But the idea is that this is a platform that allows you to scale your services across the cybersecurity spend that your customers are deploying, right? And so when we look at why SonicWall partners are switching, we'll go through some of the top 5 technical reasons right now. The first one is quite obvious. If you look at the switch-o-meter, it tends to get pretty high the more your customers get hacked. And so while, you know, you can turn around and say, hey, Adam, you wouldn't even be in business if people didn't get hacked. Don't you get hacked too? Doesn't everybody get hacked? Yes. Everybody has a vulnerability. Everybody has something they need to patch. Everyone has something they probably need to disclose at some point or another to their customers or to their partners. It's the way in which you do that and the options you have when something like this happens that makes the difference between somebody that long-term is going to keep your customer safe from getting breached and, you know, short-term sending out small messages or gift cards or something when they mess up and telling you to keep trusting them despite them not changing anything really material about their process. And so if I think about the different vulnerabilities over the past 3 or 4 years that have affected someone like SonicWall, I don't think it's really that the SSL VPN necessarily was, the root cause of a lot of these, issues, is having those open ports and services on an older protocol open to the internet for these attackers to keep breaching. I don't think that's the problem. It's that the communication, the patch time, the ability to then flip over to a zero trust design that eliminates that vulnerability, those were all quite slow. And so when you had that, switchometer and people were thinking, hey, do I leave now or later? They were somewhere between the data center burning down the first, the second, or the third time to, oh, okay, I think I've now maybe lost some customer confidence, and I've now lost confidence that I'm the security partner that should be, choosing technology for these people, on their second or third go around with a ransomware attack. So it's important for us to say that this is, of course, an extremely important reason that I think people are moving away from SonicWall and over to us. The second thing is that when you talk about the actual, permanent solution to that problem, it isn't just, hey, did you patch, right? You have to move away from the SSL VPN. And the simpler you can make that process, excuse me, for people, the easier it is for them to see a path to migrating over to you. And so with our technology, we already have a footprint of an agent out there for people that were doing things like SSL VPN or EDR or something like that. And then we released something called FireCloud to give them a simple option to connect securely to apps when they were on or off an internal network and filter out all the bad traffic. Not only that, they could take their cloud applications and decide this was the only location you were going to securely access those cloud applications from, to cut down a bunch of attacks against their clouds as well. Then you had a more secure design that you could very easily flip from your data centers or from your firewalls to say, hey, by the way, we're not going to allow remote access into the internal environment by opening a port on hundreds of firewalls that attackers can breach. We're going to have the firewall connect up to the secure cloud that is using very, very high performance traffic and new modern ways of connecting things like WatchGuard instead of SSL. And we're going to use that as the sort of new modern way we do zero trust. And then we can choose which devices have traffic between each other. We can choose with network detection and response and our access points, which two assets can communicate with each other, even if they're not running an agent, even if they're not coming through a VPN. And we have virtual firewalls kind of segmenting the internal network as well, right? A program that very much has been sold over the last 10 years is zero trust, but right now is basically get away from the old version of the VPN for people who don't fully understand it. And so this design, moving and migrating over to this design, is the number 2 technical reason that I think SonicWall partners move to us, is the simplicity and the comprehensiveness of how we've been able to implement a new design for the SSL VPN to provide more secure remote network access, right? Now, the number 3 reason is that they basically don't have an endpoint security solution. And so when they look at, getting breached, right, they typically pivot from that firewall vulnerability. That's really not the problem, is it, right? It's the ability to pivot over to a server or to a desktop or to a place where data is sitting or something critical is running and then shut it down, right? And so having an EDR technology that's also built into that agent that we're actually as good as the big guys and can do proactive things they can't, like patch and harden systems. This is another key technical element as to why our portfolio has been so strong and has been maintaining our customers instead of them getting breached constantly and sort of saying, well, that's not my fault or my problem. It was that was something that happens on your endpoint. I was just a gateway to let them into the house. I didn't really worry what happened once they got in there. And so this year in MITRE ER7, against the latest types of cybersecurity attacks that are in hybrid IT, Amazon, Windows, Linux, Mac type of environments, we scored 100% on attack visibility. We blocked everything with our endpoint, and we did it with the most efficient number of alerts being sent back to the users. So less operational friction means your people have to look at less stuff. You're probably going to make more money if when something happens, we just say, hey, this one attacker got in here and this is what they did, and we were able to block them before they got to their target. You only have to look at one investigation. Or if you do MDR, for example, you don't have to look at it at all, which is where a lot of companies are sort of facing the scaling problem. If you're a small MSP and you're competing against one of the roll-up strategy, PE-backed gigantic MSSPs, or you are one of those gigantic MSSPs, both of you could use a leg up when it comes to scaling operations. So in the MDR case, by simply having the WatchGuard product in the portfolio and being able to literally click a button, and turn on 24/7 detection and response. You can move beyond how many tickets can my people handle during the day to, hey, attacks actually happen 75% at night and on the weekend when my people don't really want to work anyway. We can take that over and basically find and stop the threats on your behalf, controlling the product we already have in place to find and stop identity, endpoint, network, and cloud attacks, right, across Amazon, Azure, and Google, which if you're running a cloud, you're probably running one of those. And so that's number 4. Number 5 actually surprises me a lot, but when you talk to our partners that have come over from SonicWall with battle scars, the simple fact that we can automatically patch the networking equipment, the endpoints, and the endpoint software that's running on those endpoint systems, that's apparently a big get for them. They had, lobbied apparently their SonicWall people for a while to try to get some modern cloud-based management techniques to be able to patch things. And so one of the things that partners who had moved over working for years from SonicWall have said to us is all the things that's in your cloud are things that we had asked SonicWall to do, right? To build automation, to build the policies, to build things so that if we have a critical patch, you don't really have to know about it. You can sort of schedule it and move it into the product really, really quickly. And your exposure, your attack surface isn't open for a very long time for somebody to breach you or your customers. And so it's a very key aspect that I think gets overlooked, but it's worth a mention because that's what people tell us. So while we don't think this is the most rad, AI cool stop a bad guy feature, it's sort of table stakes. It also is something you have to do every day, and if you're doing it automatically, you tend to save a lot of time and money and headache and worry. So that's one of the top 5 reasons that, those are the top 5 technical reasons that SonicWall partners are moving over to WatchGuard. Now, we're also talking about some of the business reasons that SonicWall partners move over to WatchGuard, and we kind of highlighted this a little bit. If you think about the idea that the cybersecurity market is made up with much more than NetSec, as a matter of fact, 3/4 of it is not NetSec, right? The idea is that it is other technology products, identity and endpoint, and it is also services, the lion's share. You have to command over top of those different technologies components. It really does make sense. Now, let's talk about margin. And if you start to pull now, it'll probably kick me out. But what is the typical margin that a smaller MSP makes in cybersecurity without WatchGuard? And it blew my mind. So some of these numbers reflect what accountants make. Some of these numbers reflect what a lawyer would make on retainer for services. And one of these numbers is what partners who don't have a good security platform make without, by adding the services to it. We'll close the poll now. Actually, I should probably take a quick look. Yeah, pretty even. It's pretty surprising. Okay, well, when we work with partners, we have something called, these run books, these playbooks. We go through these books to explain the best possible way to incorporate WatchGuard into their product offering, into their marketing messaging, into their, sales operations in some way that will make it so that you are maximizing the amount of, capabilities to grow your margins, to grow your revenues, and to prove that you have the scale to try to drive up to more and bigger deals without having these sort of big time one-time investment costs. You're not building huge capital costs. You're not, ending up with a technology that, you have to amortize over 3 years, and then only halfway through the 3-year cycle do you see the profit, right? That was typically the MSP game. And when you bring that type of thinking of, buy expensive hardware, amortize it over a few years, it's really profitable in the latter half of its life, that still blends on average to something like 10% margin, which is, it's a bad business practice, because if, accountants and lawyers can make it, certainly we deserve it. We're up all night, right? So the idea is that when you migrate to from SonicWall to us, and in Q4, I was privileged enough to talk to some of the partners that had moved over 700 firewalls to us because of our competitive programs. And by competitive programs, I mean, competitive to take out things like SonicWall. So the programs are changing all the time. We're very, very adaptive to how we can approach, kind of keeping you next to as profitable as possible when we move over to from SonicWall to WatchGuard. The value there is that, it's not after you move over, it's literally while you move over. You'll start to see the benefits almost immediately. And if you see the sales velocity of things like endpoint, identity, SASE sort of slowing down or non-existent because you're a managed networking provider who only does access points and firewalls and switches, the idea is that you obviously are leaving a lot of money on the table. All of your competitors, all of your peers will take on things like endpoint security. They will take on things like identity security. They will take on SASE in the cloud, and they will do it with, without any, care in the world for, oh, whether that firewall needs to be included in my managed service. We can do that too, right? And so the idea is, in order to create your sales velocity, in order to create that market competitiveness, it needs to be very, very easy for you to attach, to get there before anybody else. You don't want them saying, oh, we're doing a trial with SentinelOne tomorrow night. You go, with who, right? That's not the kind of life you want to live, right? And so the idea is that you should be able to, with any of the footprint we have, whether it's network security technology like FireCloud, on the endpoint, giving them secure remote access, pivoting them to a trial system, pivoting them to something like identity or endpoint, very, very easily, just by clicking a button from the cloud for trial and then clicking a button to deploy the actual technology, right? And so having that capability within the platform allows you very easily to grow the business. Once you land, you can expand, and that'll increase the sales velocity. The other thing we have is a very flexible system to pay for the subscriptions that you're buying, right? So the idea is that for MSPs, sometimes this customer has 50 endpoints, sometimes they have 12, right? Sometimes, you have a contract that's ending a month from now, and sometimes it's a year, So the idea is that if you just simply had annualized programs and it was making it really difficult for you to co-term a lot of your different contracts under endpoint, network, maybe identity security from 3 or 4 different vendors, there's a lot of nonsense in just looking at the bill of materials and the life cycles and the terms and all that stuff and getting the subscription attached to your actual customer. Well, FlexPay is an easy way built for MSPs for us to solve that. And so when you look at one of the actual accommodations we get frequently above and beyond support, which is our top, it's our top recommendation of WatchGuard. What do they love the most about us? It's our technical support. Next best thing is for the MSPs to look at something like the billing, right? Being able to buy a pocket of points and allocate those dynamically between different subscriptions at different times for different customers at different volumes is an incredible way to squeeze the profitability into your contracts that other vendors won't have. They just say, yeah, you got 3 years at 2,200. That's what you've got. Go ahead. If you don't use it, who cares? If you do use it, that's fine. If you have it tied to this customer, that's great. You can't use it for that customer. So this allows you a very simple way to be much, much more dynamic in allocating, because that's how your customers are allocating the contracts to you, right? They're going to co-term only a few things. Some things will be ending at different times. They'll have different counts for users, for endpoints, for sites that need to come on and offline, and you want to be able to redeploy that capital very easily, right? You typically couldn't sell an old firewall to a new customer very easily, even at a discount, but you can reassign these points to the customer and keep yourself in a very good position there. On top of that, of course, the labor exposure here. So cutting labor and time through central policy, telemetry, licensing, really, really important, because even if you are getting a really decent endpoint technology under the covers from your partner like a SonicWall, the idea is that that's only part of the problem, right? Is that you still need to operate it, you still need telemetry, you still need the scale to find and stop threats, especially in the age of AI when things are moving faster and more complicated through the networks. We need to have the same thing, and that should be integrated into as few consoles as we need to stare at, right? And so automation, like integration with the PSAs, with your Halos and your auto tasks and your Ninja Ones and all that stuff, that's all part of the WatchGuard story, because we know those are tools that our MSPs use and love. But we also have the concept of saying, yeah, we also have all of our stuff rolled into one incident response profile, into one ticket that can be forwarded over to any of those ticketing systems. We're going to pause here, take a look at some of the questions now as we roll through before we get into our sort of what can we do that nobody else can. We're coming up to, where's the questions here? Sorry. Vendors claim their solutions are better all the time. Why is WatchGuard really that different? Well, I think that vendors can claim everything they want. I think when you look at the mathematics on endpoint, it's really how much can you find and stop is what is measured by things like MITRE. And then how quickly can you patch? How quickly can you harden against a new application or a new configuration, right? Those are the two things you want to do: close vulnerabilities, mitigate threats, and find and stop threats if they're already in the environment. And so the two ways to measure those two things, to prove them when you try a WatchGuard product, which you can try any of our products for free just by signing up for WatchGuard 1, downloading a trial, walking through it, and we can connect with our SC team or field CTO or whoever to show you how to measure this, or how to test this. But the idea is that you should be able to find and stop threats with as few alerts as possible, and catch everything and stop everything. That's what MITRE said we can do. And you should be able to close vulnerabilities and harden any application on your operating system. That's the endpoint game. And as you roll up to network or identity, it's a very similar game, right? How many of your applications are protected by multi-factor authentication, right? How many login attempts were attempted that didn't succeed because you had a policy that could say this is a trusted device from a trusted location and a trusted user that can come through the environment now, right? So there are very simple outcomes that you can demand of your vendor that would very easily tell you what the operational friction is, how much time you're going to spend with the product, frankly, how good it is, how effective it is at doing its core job, finding and stopping threats or hardening systems. And then there's also the cost perspective, right? Once you bundle those things together, it's very easy to pull up a book and say, okay, what was the price? And there's so many different pricing ladders that we now have for things, where anybody coming in to try to steal a business and say like, hey, we're going to give you this very basic next-gen AV, no logging, nothing special, but it's going to be $3 or 60 cents or something like that per device. You could very easily pull up the sheet and go, yeah, I can get there. I can get competitive with them on that, do almost nothing antivirus, and then I can layer up to something else. So that's I think what would make us stand apart, because other vendors are unwilling to do that, right? They're unwilling to invest in other technology. They're unwilling to demonstrate those metrics. They run very few POCs, especially unless the deal is really large. And so there's lots of ways in which we can prove it, and we do prove it every single day. Next question is, vendors claim, no, that's the same. How is WatchGuard's platform supposed to make me more profitable compared to SonicWall? Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think comes up a lot is, if we got both products for the same price, how am I more profitable if you give me the same product at the same price? And it's because downstream, you can add risk to your calculator, like most CIOs do these days, right? They say, I have to price in the risk of getting breached in this design versus this design. I have to price in the operating costs. I have to say, okay, well, how many alerts a day would I have to look at from a SonicWall? How many patches a week would I have to deploy with a SonicWall? How many policies would I have to deploy that aren't centralized? How hard is it for me to debug something? If it's, you got to log into the local thing through SSH and run some debug commands versus take a look at the traffic monitoring that's up there. So you can break out the tasks as well for the operating model, and then see how the platform is delivering better admin, better managed services capabilities for yourself. And that's really one of the ways that you're going to start to calculate the cost reduction, is the idea that the FTE is going to be lower, meaning you can do much more things, right? On the days that you're not hacked, you want your partners and your customers to see that you are bringing value, right? And so the best way to do that is to focus on making sure you can demonstrate, hey, what it took to get you secure was to review this much data and find these many threats and block them at this amount of time and keep you patched, and all that stuff is good, A-OK, 100%, everything's running on time and well. But then we need to proactively move the bar forward in terms of hardening the systems, locking down new applications, closing new vulnerabilities, and automating that process as well. So that when they see reports, when they see data back from your company about the value you're providing as an MSP, that big 50% chunk of the cybersecurity spend, most of the people that are successful are able to demonstrate offensive security, are able to demonstrate proactive value, and not just, hey, nothing happened on the firewall, but we were physically present. That's not going to be enough in 2026. All right, we're getting close to the end here. We still have lots of time for questions. I'm just going to do somewhat of a recap here, but basically what we can do that SonicWall doesn't. So the first thing is we make our own endpoint security product, right? This is important because it does not just do detection and response, though it does that extremely well, as good as anybody on the market, and you can ask MITRE how that goes. Then you go to the proactive capabilities, the things that we can do that prevent your customers from getting hacked and show value on the days that you are not hacked, are all things that our EDR component of our endpoint is really poised to do that SonicWall does not, right? If you look at identity security, right, there are, these tokens and other things that, other providers have, but they're not really full-blown MFA products. After this acquisition of SafeNet, the work we've done on the MFA product to not only authenticate with two-factor authentication local users on Windows, Linux, Mac, but also the SaaS integrations, the zero trust policy, right, this geography, this device, security being pushed down through the same agent, right? All that work done in the identity environment are things that will protect firewall customers downstream from getting hacked again. Because as we all know, credential stuffing, that is getting your username and password from the dark web and just plugging it into an SSL VPN, the logic around trying to find out whether that's a bad guy or a good guy is really, really difficult. So it's better that we don't just rely on the password for things like network security technology, and certainly relying on things like session cookies or something like that to get into Office 365, right? Because those are all very, very dangerous things to do, because the attackers have constantly automated their ways into these environments this way. So, making sure you protect your very significant cloud assets and things like 365 and Teams with multi-factor, things like Salesforce, things like Tableau, things like, ADP, all things you should have protected with the multi-factor authentication product like AuthPoint, as well as the local workstation in case you lose it. But then that also helps with the NetSec side and making sure that everybody who authenticates through even FireCloud, or if you do choose, which you shouldn't, to stay on SSL VPN, you can authenticate that way as well. So we do that, they don't, right? It's so many features there in AuthPoint that we have that they do not, in EDR that they do not. AI-powered MDR, also a big deal with us after the acquisition. That's where I came from, is where I was literally, one of the first employees there. The idea is that the AI-powered MDR is really one of the cornerstones to, once you have all this data, and people need to go to sleep, somebody needs to be able to find and stop the attacker in the time frame they're working with, which is minutes and seconds and not hours and days, right? And so the idea is that with our AI-powered MDR, you are looking at less alerts, you are not having to respond to things. We can take over the capability to contain and try to eradicate the threat, endpoint, network, cloud, and we can operate all the technology we already own to do that, and we can also operate others, right? The release, if you're watching our social media, feed today of OpenMDR, is sort of a long-time vision for the folks who were acquired at Act Zero to finally bring to the market, which is the ability not just to run our stuff better and different than everybody else, like we've been doing with EDR, AuthPoint, and the NetSec products, but doing that with other people's products as well. We've been doing it with AWS and Microsoft 365. We've been doing it with Defender. We can now do it on top of third-party as well, third-party agents, third-party firewalls. So check that out. We'd be happy to talk about that one. But basically, the MDR story is much more comprehensive, much more effective here than it is there. FireCloud SASE, of course, I would love to say this is something SonicWall doesn't do. It is something SonicWall does. But the idea is that, no two SASEs are equal. If you don't make endpoint security and you don't make identity security, and it's not sitting on the endpoint, then you really just have a VPN hosted in the cloud, right? And if that's your answer to SASE after a Banyan acquisition, or white labeling Perimeter 81 or whatever it is that you were saying, yeah, me too, I do SASE. That's not how that product and service is going to be used. It's not how it's used now. So the idea is that, that is part of the story, but unless it's plugged into the first two or three things, you don't really have an enterprise SASE. It's not blocking threats at scale on the wire. It's not taking in the zero trust policies for your identity and endpoint. It's not configured to give you remote access very securely across the gateways already and very simply through a single policy, right? It's just simply a separate product with a separate config that also gives you a NordVPN-like look, right? Lastly, the two things here are really around business, but cloud delivered protection is great because it simplifies things. You really don't have time to be dialing into different products or different consoles. The policy, the telemetry, the ability to integrate with your PSA, that's all going to be table stakes for how you run things, templates, just buy something, send it to somebody, they plug it in, it shows up, right? We don't really need this very complicated, field work and all this extra, maintenance that goes into not having things as basic as, being able to patch on the endpoint or patch to the firewall. In our estimation, it's basic, but for a lot of vendors, they still suffer under this problem. This is still a Friday night for a lot of admins. And if you look at, FlexPay, right, the idea is that billing should meet you where you're at. You should be in control of how you assign subscriptions and, licensing to your customers. And we think that the best way to do that is to give you all the power you want. You buy the bucket, you distribute how you need to, and that gives you a lot of flexibility to move through your contracts. Okay, we're getting more questions in here. At least that's what this orange thing. I'm having a real hard time reading this one. Sorry, team, if you are trying to ask a question, and you probably just go to the entire audience and see if you can ask the question that way. I got green text, but it didn't say what the question was, so we'll just skip through that. All right. So, I mean, there's a lot of resources here that we could leverage to demonstrate the value of our product, the capabilities of our product, the licensing, and the ways that we can partner in here. There is a tremendous amount, I think, of angst around the VPN problem. There's certainly it should be angst around the product portfolio and where the company's going. I think that the partners that have migrated from SonicWall, of which hundreds of firewalls a month, from these partners are moving over to us, and it's a very graceful transition. The policy, the migration tools that we've been able to deploy, the SE support that you get when it's time to start, the actual flip over. Those are all things that we're really proud to say we've been supporting our partners doing now and quite successfully for the past 2 quarters. And so I especially with the types of competitive takeout programs that we've been putting up. So we'd encourage you guys to connect with us, to get to the WatchGuard 1 program, to try out the stuff we're talking about, look at maybe NFR or some sort of POCs that you can do to begin the process here of at least educating yourself at what we can do and seeing the platform for yourselves. All right. I shouldn't leave without saying there's also another webinar that's coming up on the 29th. It is about our endpoint, where we're going to be talking to a GigaOM analyst. This is similar to the MITRE webinar we did earlier this week, but it's going to be about their evaluation of our EDR product. So you can always check out more events on our events page. Just log into or go to the WatchGuard.com page, and then hit the resource center for events. And then you'll see your ability to register there, or just follow us on social media, and I'm sure we'll tell you about it time and again. Okay, I'm going to just double check. Here we go. More questions. Will WatchGuard be adding any multi-location VPN connection service so that people don't need non-corporate solutions like NordVPN anymore, which might be seen as bypassing WatchGuard security when used? Yeah, definitely. When you look at the way that NordVPN has built their sort of hop around to different POPs, so they have mostly what they're doing is saying, I've got a bunch of POPs. If you want to come from, anywhere, Bermuda or something, you can flip over to that one, come through, we'll tunnel your security through this POP where nobody's looking at stuff, and you're good to go, right? And so the way that our POP design is kind of worked out is we do have a number of points of presence, which would kind of represent in the NordVPN world, those little country markers when you open the app to click on. And so there will be modifications to the client interface where you can try to pick what you're connecting through, I should call it. But keep in mind, the number one reason you partner with a company like WatchGuard is to protect the traffic that's coming through there. So on NordVPN, you can go to a malicious website and download every virus you've ever heard of, right? The idea is that you can click through, get your credentials stolen. They're not really giving you any security of the traffic. They're just giving you a somewhat anonymous way to tunnel through their points of presence, which without a SOC 2, I'm a little bit hard on NordVPN. That's why I never recommended using it at any one of our companies, is the idea that you don't have a SOC 2. I can't really guarantee that anything you claim is actually true, because I don't have somebody that's come out and said, hey, by the way, I've audited you guys, and yeah, you're not looking at the traffic or the client or the metadata or anything else that's coming through here. Now, that notwithstanding, and no knock on NordVPN, the real knock is that if I was to download viruses, I wouldn't be able to block it. So yes, the points of presence thing is something we already have in FireCloud. The connection manager is something that you'll be able to pick the points of presence in the future. And the idea that we decrypt the traffic that allows us to find and stop the threats that are within it, which decrypting doesn't sound like a very privacy-centric thing, but unless we decrypt the payload from the malicious website, we're not going to be able to see the virus they're trying to download through the network, and then all of a sudden it's on your endpoint and you're hoping to stop it there. With us, you do get powerful TLS decryption. You do get the capability to find and block those threats. If you're worried about privacy, you can do that on a category-specific basis. So you're not decrypting people's banking and looking at whatever they think we can look at. But the idea is that's how we're doing that. So FireCloud is definitely the answer to that. But keep in mind, it's not the only NetSec solution you need to protect your business, right? If that TV behind me gets hacked, I might be good with my little FireCloud, connection, preventing anything coming in from the sides, maybe with the EDR firewall, network access enforcement. But I need two products to do that. If I go to the internal network and I say, okay, there's a printer next to me that they want to hack, or a hypervisor next to that, you're going to need something like NDR. So the FireCloud is a very good story for people that are looking for that, like NordVPN on the road connection. It's got the security filtering to be able to clean the product up from downloading viruses. And then obviously you can also use it as a one-stop shop VPN to VPN simultaneously into the firewall without that low, slow bandwidth reduction that you get by trying to backhaul, which I've seen people try to do in the pandemic. Didn't really work out well. And then obviously the idea is that once you get behind the firewall, so that's in front of the firewall, once you get behind the firewall, there's a whole bunch of havoc that can be reaped there. You need something like NDR to do it. And if you're worried about operating it because you're like, this is going to produce so many alerts when people go to these websites and download things and get threats on their machine, you can also layer MDR so that you don't even have to look at that. So if you're worried that this is going to create a massive volume of for you in terms of review process, you can hand that off to MDR very, very easily. All right, one more question. Multi-VPN, I think I answered that one. If I didn't, ask whatever I may have missed in your question, please ask again. How does WatchGuard Total Unified Security Platform do central cloud management and give you more money into customer estate and grow margin? Yeah, so if you think about your customers as sort of needing this much security at least, and needing this much services at least, and their willingness to spend money is only really based on the fact that you have to prove the value probably before you sell it, like a lot of people. One of the ways that you're sort of getting them into the cloud platform, which it's an AWS hosted platform, they've got 3 regions, they're very compliant. So ISO 27001 GDPR, your data is very well vetted every single year by multiple auditors to make sure that we're not just giving anybody access who wants to read your files. And the idea is that we have very good role-based protections. But once you're in that cloud, once you've got that estate there, as they say, as you said, the idea of having your customers, network and your customers' endpoint now available to trial new products or trial new subscriptions or to trial new services, and having that mapped out to say like, okay, I've got customer A, customer B, these guys are leveraging 10%, these guys are leveraging 90%. I can set up a trial here, here, and here, and then build these reports that will deliver to the customer at least the visibility of, oh my gosh, all my remote users at home have been downloading viruses like crazy, or visiting websites that they shouldn't have, or have been locking up their computers with all of this productivity killing software on the endpoint. All these things you could discover with trials of the different products. Once you have the agent down, once you have that network security, you can layer those services in there. How that translates into money, obviously, is that you can sell them those additional services. But you also have this concept of saying like, well, if they want to buy right now, there's many different ways that you can then roll that into a very simple contract. It's just almost like you see with consumer subscriptions, just, you don't have to wait until your subscription's over to upsell, right? And you could offer them great incentives like that, so you don't have to wait around until the contract's ending to go and get more business. What are the dangers of sticking with SonicWall this year? I mean, last year, 2025, was a pretty telling year for what it's going to be like to stick with SonicWall. There is very few people, I think, that understand that it is a structural problem. It is a problem with the SSL protocol, and not with the one time we had a bug in SonicWall's SSL VPN. And so just like Palo Alto, Fortinet, and Checkpoint, and us, and everybody Sophos that makes a firewall will have a flaw in the SSL protocol that will be exploited in slightly new ways each time and for each firewall, meaning there's going to be some distance between the patches. It is very important that you don't stay with a vendor that just has a firewall hardware, firewall technology, or just the NetSec technology. You have to move to the zero trust design to get rid of the SSL structural problem, or it will get breached in your firewall and you will ultimately see ransomware at your customer or some sort of data loss. If you stay in that design, right? So you are needing to move away from SonicWall for number one. That's one of the few designs they offer, right? And so if you can't move away from the design, if there's no exit, you really have to start planning for the future. And the next part of that is, okay, well, even if you could agree that maybe you went to a zero trust design where the SSL VPN is no longer enabled, or you've configured all the right stuff on your management plane to lock it down as per their guidance, and you're now, buttoned up and insured maybe on that not happening again, you're still sort of stuck when they go and steal your cookies to break into Office 365 or some other aspect of the endpoint attacks that you're now relying on somebody else to do. You're still stuck on, not having a unified policy between endpoint, network, identity, cloud, right? So if you take this forward a little bit and say, well, once we close the gap on the network technology, I still have the gap on the identity. I still have the gap on the endpoint. And there's no real, material investment from the company to move forward. You're literally just white labeling a product from somebody else. Who knows how long that relationship's going to work out? And, then hopefully pacifying you that there are other products on the market that you can integrate with. And that's not how a platform works. And so just like those 50 vendors who just did firewalls sort of disappeared in the 2000s, companies that fail to modernize, companies that fail to move to this platform design will eventually pay by their customers finding a better deal somewhere else or finding a more secure design somewhere else and achieved much more simply, right? And so that's what you should be pushing for, is the simplest design that makes you the most money, most autonomous offensive and defensive platform in the market, and making sure that you are competitive to the big and small players in your MSP space, or, frankly, sticking with SonicWall because you're friends, which, at some point you have to say, the relationship has let me down 3 years in a row. What's next year going to look like? So I would leave it at that, and say that at the very least, you owe yourself, your company, your customers, the due diligence to go and look at somebody else. It is very important you understand that when these ransomware attacks happen, if the customer pays, this stuff goes to organized crime in nation states that are really bad guys, right? These aren't kids, right? It's a problem. So you do have a bit more of a moral obligation than I'd say to look at us, frankly, look at others, right? Bring more vendors to the table, make it part of your annual, your job to do this. The most successful companies that we have in our portfolio, the most successful partners, the ones in the hundreds of millions of dollars that are making 60, 70% margin on their cybersecurity managed services, every single year they bake off the cybersecurity products and services that they have, and they should, because a lot can change in a year. And so I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much, obviously, for attending the webinar. I really thank you for your participation. I thank you for your attendance, your audience. We hope to see you on the next one. If I didn't cover any of your questions, please let me know. Much appreciated, and thanks for joining.